They fought for a country that never truly fought for them. After surviving the trenches of World War I, the gas, the mud, the constant threat of death, black soldiers returned home believing they had earned something more: respect, dignity, a chance at real freedom. But America greeted them with something else entirely: bullets, burning neighborhoods, mobs waiting at train stations, ready to erase them before their uniforms even touched the ground. This is the story of the black veterans America tried to destroy in the summer that changed everything. This is Dice Unite, where the story continues together. "1919 was a nation on edge, a country trembling under the weight of everything it refused to confront. The Great War had ended, and millions of soldiers were returning home at once. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, the economy was cracking under pressure, and in factory towns across America, white workers saw black laborers not as neighbors but as competition. During the war, many black men had been hired as low-wage strike beakers. Now, resentment simmered like gasoline waiting for a spark. Then came the Red Scar, a nationwide panic that whispered that socialism, Bolshevism, and radicalism were infecting American cities. Newspapers and politicians pointed fingers at black communities, claiming without proof that black workers were being manipulated by communist agitators. Fear became propaganda, propaganda became hate, and hate always finds a target. At the same time, America was changing. The Great Migration had already begun reshaping the nation's cities. Nearly 500,000 black Southerners fled Jim Crow terror and headed north during the 1910s, searching for jobs and dignity denied to them in the South. Chicago's black population exploded by 148%, Philadelphia's by nearly 500%, and with every train arrival, some white residents grew more anxious, convinced that black migrants threatened their jobs, housing, and a place in society. But nothing frightened white supremacists more than the return of black World War I veterans. Roughly 380,000 black men had served in the war. They had fought in trenches, survived gas attacks, and shed blood in French fields for a country that still labeled them second-class citizens. Yet something changed inside them overseas. They were respected, saluted, treated as men. They returned home with discipline, pride, and a new understanding of their worth. Leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois told them plainly, "We returned fighting, not with hatred, but with courage, dignity, and determination to challenge the brutality they had endured for generations." White America heard those words and felt threatened. A black man in uniform, confident, trained, and unwilling to bow, represented everything Jim Crow feared. So mobs targeted them. At least 13 black veterans were lynched after the war. Some were murdered while still wearing their uniforms. One of them was Wilbur Little, who survived Europe only to be beaten to death in Georgia for refusing to remove the uniform he had earned with his life. Lynching spiked to 83 in a single year. The Ku Klux Klan swelled into the millions, and federal agents warned that black soldiers were no longer fighting back into their old place, as if that were ever their place to begin. Pressure built, tension sharpened. America became a nation standing knee-deep in dry grass. All it needed was a match. And in 1919, the match was struck again and again. From spring to early autumn, at least 25 major riots and mob attacks erupted across the country. NAACP leader James Weldon Johnson named it Red Summer for all the blood that flowed. Hundreds died, thousands were injured, entire communities were burned to ashes, and through it all, black veterans stood at the center, refusing to back down, even when the whole nation seemed determined to crush them. Charleston, South Carolina, May 10th, 1919. The spark was small, just a rumor, but in 1919, a rumor was enough to set a city on fire. Word spread that a black man had shot a white sailor at a local pool hall. Within hours, white Navy sailors and local whites poured into the streets, arming themselves by raiding a shooting gallery. Then the mob turned on the black community. They beat black people at random. They smashed black businesses. They hunted anyone who looked black, no questions asked. Some black residents, including veterans, fired back in self-defense as the violence spread. The city police were helpless. Marines from the nearby Navy Yard eventually deployed to regain control, detaining white sailors and disarming some black residents. By dawn, 3 black men were dead, and at least 17 wounded, and multiple sailors injured. Charleston's mayor promised compensation and even formed an interracial committee, but refused to hire black police officers. Charleston was the nation's warning, a preview of what fear and hatred of black veterans would unleash across America. Longview, Texas, July 10th through the 12th, 1919. This time, black residents were ready. Tensions were already high. Black farmers had begun selling their cotton directly to the market, cutting out the white middleman. And when a black journalist was blamed for reporting on an interracial relationship, whites beat him nearly to death. That night, a white mob drove to his home to finish the job, but black defenders, some likely veterans, opened fire first. Wounded and humiliated, the white mob regrouped and broke into a hardware store to arm themselves. They returned with reinforcements, burning black homes, businesses, and the house of local black physicians. Texas governor declared martial law and sent the Texas Rangers and National Guard into Longview. One black man, Marion Bush, was shot dead by a posse while fleeing protective custody. Dozens were arrested, 17 white men for attempted murder, 21 black men for their own safety. None were ever tried. Longview confirmed a new reality. Black communities, especially black veterans, were no longer facing violence with bowed heads. They were fighting back. Washington, D.C., July 19th through the 24th, 1919. The nation's capital became a battlefield. White newspapers ran sensational, fabricated stories of black men assaulting white women. The headlines lit a fire of fear and rage. On July 19th, hundreds of drunk white servicemen, a mob in uniform, as one historian called them, stormed the streets with pistols and clubs. They dragged black riders off streetcars, beat pedestrians on Pennsylvania Avenue, and attacked black neighborhoods. One of the first killed was Randall Neal, a 22-year-old black veteran. A black man was beaten with a brick filled with handkerchiefs near the White House. Violence unfolded in the literal shadow of the Capitol. And still, President Woodrow Wilson said nothing. But Washington was different from other cities because 5,000 black veterans lived there. When police refused to protect them, these men mobilized. Black snipers took position on rooftops to defend their neighborhoods. Barricades went up around Howard University. Armed black patrols protected families through the night. For the first time in American racial violence, white rioters suffered heavily, casualties too. Only when the situation spiraled beyond control did Wilson act. 2,000 federal troops marched into the city with bayonets fixed. Estimate suggests up to 40 people died, far more than the official claim of 7. Washington proved something powerful. Black veterans would not die quietly, not even in the capital of the United States. Chicago, July 27th through August 3rd, 1919. The fuse was a boy, just 17 years old. Eugene Williams drifted on a raft near a segregated Southside beach. A white woman, enraged that a black boy crossed an invisible line, threw rocks until one struck Eugene's head. He drowned before anyone could reach him. When black residents demanded the killer's arrest, the police refused. The city erupted. White mobs stormed black neighborhoods, shooting into homes and businesses. Black residents retaliated. These were people who had endured bombings, intimidation, and years of racist housing violence. On the South Side, the Black Belt, black veterans took command. They formed militias, posted rooftop snipers, even broke into a National Guard army to seize rifles. Their military training saved countless lives. White gangs quickly learned that Black Belt was no place to invade. Still, the destruction was immense. 38 people died, 23 black, 15 white, 537 injured, 1,000 plus black families left homeless. Governor Frank Loden eventually sent 6,000 troops to restore order. A landmark investigation later exposed Chicago's deep segregation, racist policing, and white gang violence. Black Chicago already knew the truth. They had fought tyranny in Europe and again in their own city. Knoxville, Tennessee, August 30th to the 31st, 1919. The pattern repeated. Accusations, hysteria, mob. A white woman was murdered. Police arrested a black man, Maurice Mays. Despite weak evidence, thousands have gathered at the jail to lynch him. When they discovered Mays had been moved, the mob raided the jail, stole weapons, and rampaged through black neighborhoods. Gun battles erupted in the streets. The National Guard deployed. Machine guns were mounted downtown. By the end, at least 7 people were dead and hundreds wounded. Many black families fled the city permanently. Mays was later executed by all-white juries, still proclaiming his innocence. Knoxville proved no region was immune. Even in the Appalachian Mountains, the mob ruled. Omaha, Nebraska, September 28th through the 29th, 1919. This was terror broadcasted in broad daylight. A black laborer, Will Brown, was accused of rape. The lynch mob gathered outside the courthouse. They set the building on fire, hoping smoke would force Brown out. Mayor Edward Smith tried to calm them, and the mob nearly lynched him too. They dragged Will Brown outside, beat him, hanged him from a lamppost, filled his body with bullets, burned him in the street while thousands watched. Photographs of lynching were sold as postcards. Federal troops eventually restored order, but justice never came. Not one white participant was punished. Omaha exposed America's darkest truth. black life had no little value. Even cities in the Midwest embraced publicly lynching as celebration. Elaine, Arkansas, September 30th through October 2nd, 1919. This wasn't a riot, it was a massacre. Black sharecroppers gathered in a church, many of them veterans, to demand fair pay. A white deputy arrived, shots were fired, and the deputy died. By dawn, white planters were spreading a lie. The Negroes are rising in insurrection. Within hours, hundreds of white men from Arkansas, Mississippi, and beyond descended on Elaine with rifles. They shot black men, women, and children on sight. Families fled into the swamps, hunted like animals. Some soldiers joined the killing. Historians after historians agree, Elaine may be the deadliest racial massacre in U.S. history. The death toll, at least 100 black people, and likely over 200. Only 5 whites died, mostly in early exchanges. Nearly 300 black residents were arrested, tortured, forced to confess. 12 black men were sentenced to death in shame trials. It took the NAACP and the Supreme Court to eventually overturn the convictions, but no white killer was ever charged, ever. Elaine was the climax of Red Summer, a massacre buried for generations because its truth was too devastating for America to face. Red Summer was not a handful of isolated riots. It was a national uprising of white violence. At least 25 cities and towns erupted in bloodshed. Norfolk, Virginia, 2 black servicemen killed after a parade for returning veterans. New York City, violent melees in Harlem. Philadelphia, 4 days of attacks on black homes. Baltimore, Cleveland, New Orleans, Indianapolis, Bisbee, Arizona, Macon, Georgia, Charleston, West Virginia. The Equal Justice Initiative counted 97 lynchings in 1919 outside the riots themselves. Red Summer was not a moment, it was an era, a season, when white America declared open season on black life. But something else happened too. For the first time on such a scale, black Americans fought back, especially black veterans, men who had tasted dignity overseas, men who refused surrender at home. They had survived the trenches of Europe, but Red Summer taught them that battlefield was waiting at home. A defining feature of 1919 was the role of black World War I veterans, men who refused to let their communities be slaughtered without resistance. In city after city, they stood at the center of defense, using their training, discipline, and courage to confront mobs that expected them to run. In Washington, D.C., black ex-soldiers climbed onto rooftops and took up sniper positions to stop white riders from marching unchecked through black neighborhoods. They organized patrols, guarded families, and held the line in a city where the police had abandoned them. In Chicago, veterans from the legendary units, the 370th Infantry and the 369th Harlem Hellfighters, and others formed militias. They coordinated block-by-block defense, patrolled the South Side, and even raided an armory for rifles when authorities refused to protect them. Witnesses describe how they set up barricades around black districts and stood guard with the same calm, steady focus they had shown in France. One churchman marveled that these men carried themselves with as much calmness as if getting ready to shoot the Kaiser soldiers again. These veterans saved lives. Their resistance blunted attacks that would wipe entire communities off the map. But their bravery came at a cost. To white supremacists, a black man with a gun, a black man who had been respected overseas was their greatest nightmare. So black veterans became special targets of mob violence. At least 13 were lynched during 1919. Many more were beaten, hunted, or barely escaped with their lives. In the Washington Post, white citizens even placed ads urging white veterans to gather and attack black neighborhoods. Brother in arms turned against brothers in arms. During the Elaine massacre, white mobs and soldiers deliberately singled out black veterans, seeing them as the leaders of a non-existent rebellion. And in Omaha, Will Brown's statue as black veterans likely sealed his fate before the mobs even laid hands on him. Yet despite the danger, their defiance reshaped black America. These men shattered the lie of black passivity. They proved publicly, fearlessly, that African Americans will not forever suffer violence in silence. As historian David F. Kruger wrote, 1919 was the year that African Americans fought back. The poet Claude McKay captured this new spirit in his famous sonnet, If We Must Die, written during Red Summer, a battle cry that echoed from street to street. Like men, we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. Their courage inspired a generation. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote that these returning soldiers were now fighting a sterner, longer war, not in France, but in the streets of America, demanding that democracy they had bled for. And many of the leaders who would carry the torch into the civil rights movement were veterans shaped by the furnace of 1919, men who never forgot the lessons learned in a summer of fire. Red Summer was not driven by hidden conspirators in the shadows. It was driven by ordinary white Americans. In city after city, the mobs weren't wearing hoods. They weren't whispering in secret societies. They were everyday white citizens, factory workers, shoe keepers, veterans, police officers, who needed no mask to unleash terror. As a historian note, most writers were unaffiliated, whites who felt no shame, no fear, and no need for the Klan to authorize their violence. Yet the Klan was rising in the background, fueled by the racist blockbuster, The Birth of a Nation. The Ku Klux Klan surged back to life in the 1910s. By 1919, the Klan was marching again, literally. In Montgomery, Alabama, its first public ride since Reconstruction took place that summer. Across the South, new recruits poured in, drawn by propaganda about Negro uprising and Bolshevik plots. Men in robed were reported on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., adding a chilling, organized shadow to the street-level violence. But the Klan wasn't the only force behind the terror. In some cities, white citizens' councils, American Legion posts, and even police fraternities helped create the condition for violence. In Chicago, white ethnic gangs like the Raging Cults, with political backing, acted as a preliminary force. Black neighborhoods, police officers, many sharing the same ethnic backgrounds as these gangs, often looked away or joined them. In Omaha, the mob that lynched Will Brown wasn't made of the rough element. It included businessmen, clerks, fathers, and people who felt deputized by witness itself. And in Norfolk, Virginia, active-duty white Navy sailors and local police joined forces against black residents. White supremacy did not need to hide. It marched in uniform, patrolled in badges, and killed in broad daylight. The violence of 1919 was powered not just by mobs, but by newspapers. Major white-owned papers printed false stories, racial slurs, and fabricated accusations designed to inflame white readers. The most common lie, the oldest lie in American history, was the claim that black men were raping white women. It was a lynching script that needed no evidence. In Washington, the Washington Post went further than sensationalism. It published the exact meeting place where white servicemen should gather to attack black neighborhoods. It was a mob invitation printed on the front page of a respected newspaper. The Washington Times splashed headlines like Negro thugs, ensuring panic spread faster than the truth. Even decades later, the Washington Post would acknowledge its complicity. This was media as gasoline, and the nation was filled with matches. To deflect responsibility, politicians and newspapers pushed a new lie. Black resistance wasn't real. It was the work of Bolshevik agitators. The Justice Department under Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and a young J. Edgar Hoover obsessed over Reds. They imagined that black Americans who no longer accepted second-class treatment must have been manipulated by foreign ideologies. Senator James Vanderman claimed the Bolshevik emissaries were stirring up violence among black people. Even President Woodrow Wilson mused that foreign propaganda might be behind the riots. This narrative was convenient. It erased the centuries of oppression that fueled black anger. It blamed outsiders instead of acknowledging the violence committed by white Americans. Historians have found zero evidence that communists incited the riots, but the lie served this purpose. While white papers poured fuel on the fire, the black press fought to expose the truth. Papers like the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, and the NAACP's The Crisis risked everything to document the atrocities. Their reporting, however, made them targets. Longview, Texas erupted partly because white mobs were enraged at a Chicago Defender article revealing the truth about a lynching. NAACP investigator Walter White, whose skin was light enough to pass as white, went undercover into riot zones, risking his life to expose the horrors in Elaine and elsewhere. When locals discovered he was black, he narrowly escaped being killed. Despite intimidation, censorship, and threats, the black press told the world that white newspapers refused to print, that the mobs were white, that the victims were black, and that the violence was unprovoked. Across the country, authorities reacted with hesitation, denial, or complicity. In almost every city, the National Guard or federal troops were deployed only after 4 days of unchecked violence. Chicago's mayor waited almost 4 days before requesting troops, arguing with the governor while the city burned. President Wilson remained silent during the Washington riot until foreign diplomats began asking why the U.S. Capitol looked like a war zone. Police in many cities refused to arrest white rioters, often joining them. In Omaha, officers failed to stop the mob from storming the courthouse. Some were beaten back themselves. While troops finally arrived, they restored order with bayonets and curfews, but justice rarely followed. Grand juries filled with white men who shared the same prejudice as the mobs overwhelmingly indicted black defenders rather than white attackers. In Washington, 2 black men received long prison sentences while white riders faced little consequence. In Chicago, only minor convictions were handed out, and white gang leaders escaped accountability entirely. Across America, white perpetrators walked free. The message was unmistakable. The justice system did not value black life. At the national level, no comprehensive federal action was taken. The NAACP pushed hard for the Dreyer anti-lynching bill, first introduced in 1918. Red Summer intensified the demand. The bill passed the House in 1922, a historic victory, but Southern senators filibustered it to death. President Woodrow Wilson, who had championed the human rights abroad, refused to champion them at home. His silence during the worst racial violence of the century is a lasting stain on his legacy. Red Summer did not end with the final riot. It did not end when troops rolled their bayonets back into their armories. And it did not end when newspapers moved on to the next scandal of 1919. For Black America, the war simply changed battlefields. The veterans who had once fought the Kaisers now found themselves fighting sheriffs, mobs, newspapers, and lawmakers. They survived mustard gas in France only to face firebombs in their own neighborhood. They had defended democracy abroad, yet they were denied democracy at home. But they did not return defeated, they returned determined. Across the nation, black veterans emerged as teachers, ministers, union leaders, organizers, and early civil rights activists, men who carried within them the memory of 1919 and the knowledge that freedom would not be given, it would be taken. Red Summer forced America to confront a truth it had long buried, that black resistance was real, disciplined, and unbreakable, that black people were not going back to the world before the war, that the lie of white supremacy could no longer survive unchallenged. The Great Migration accelerated. Thousands fled the towns where mobs ruled, searching for northern cities where they could start over. And then, even when racism followed them, they carried something new with them, a fire ignited by veterans who stood their ground. Black newspapers strengthened. The NAACP grew into a national force. Writers, poets, and thinkers transformed trauma into art, strategy, and vision. When Claude McKay wrote, "If we must die," he wasn't addressing the mobs of 1919. He was speaking to generations. His words became a blueprint for dignity under fire, a hymn of defiance, a vow. Throughout the decades that followed, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Riders, the March on Washington, Selma, you could still hear the echoes of 1919 carried by veterans of a war the history books never taught. The veterans of Red Summer taught America something it desperately wanted to ignore. Black courage is older than black oppression. Black resistance is older than white supremacy, and black freedom will outlast them both. Red Summer was a season of blood, but it was also the birth of a new black consciousness, forged in fire and held together by men who refused to bow. Their fight was not just for themselves, it was for us, for every generation that would come after. And today, when we look back on 1919, we don't just see the mobs or the ashes, we see the soldiers standing in the doorways of burning homes. We see the snipers on the rooftops of Washington. We see the militias on Chicago's South Side. We see the farmers in Elaine who held a rifle not for rebellion but for survival. We see a people who refused to surrender. Red Summer tried to silence them and said it made them immortal. This is their story, their legacy, their unfinished war. This is Dias Unite, where the story continues together.